Well, hello once again, and another very warm welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV. And if you're a recent subscriber to my channel, then I hope you continue to enjoy my video postings of these old classic dirt bikes. Now, in this next video, we're going to take a look at another superb vintage classic from the Rob Hughes collection. And as you can see, Rob has one or two very rare machines in his private assortment of vintage racers, and we'll be featuring each and every one of these bikes in the coming weeks here on my Classic Dirt Bike TV channel. So if you've not already done it, then please subscribe, as there are some very interesting bikes to follow. So we're going to take a look now at Rob's 1973 CCM. Now, this of course was one of the very first years of production of the Alan Clues CCM dynasty, when he set up the company and then registered the name Clues Competition Machines. Now, although these 1973 models were the very first Alan Clues bikes to bear the actual name of CCM, these weren't of course the first machines that Alan actually made, because the year previous Alan was building these Clues Strokers, which were of course Mike Etoff's frames and Alan's excellent engineering and upgrading of the BSA 50 motor, which incidentally were all built in Alan's little garage at the rear of his house. Now, Alan decided to build a batch of 7 machines initially, although the word soon got around about these British-made scramblers, and Alan was then inundated with potential buyers, and it was the popularity and the interest of these Clues Strokers that led to Alan setting up his new venture of Clues Competition Machines. Now, these Clues Strokers were built in 1972, and as I said previously, it was the popularity of these bikes that led to Alan setting up the Clues Competition Machines company and then building this 1973 model. Now, our featured 1973 bike is a fully restored machine, and just one of the many CCM bikes that you're going to see from Rob's collection in the coming weeks. Now, this bike is the short stroke model made famous by CCM's first ever works rider, who was of course Andy Ainsworth, who made a huge impact in the motocross world when he was seen blasting these new CCMs around the racetracks of the UK. Now, this bike is an almost 100% correct machine, apart from maybe a different carburetor that's been fitted, which was just to enable Rob to get the bike running whenever he needed to start it. But other than that, this is very much a period correct bike from that 1973 year. Now, this particular bike of Rob's is still even fitted with the original 1973 Girling rear shocks. Now, these are very rare parts to find on one of these CCMs these days, and you just don't see these old Girling dampers now, but back in the day they were quite a common fixture to many British-made motorcycles, and Rob's example here also still has the original Girling gas shock sticker on the top, which again is a very rare sight from that 1970s period. Now, as you're no doubt aware, magnesium parts were widely used on many of these early CCMs, including these top and bottom fork yokes. Now, the front forks were Italian-made Serianis, which were quite a decent suspension system for that 1973 period, and these were used on a multitude of different motocross and road-going bikes of the 1970s, although by today's standards they were very basic, but of course these were the suspension technologies of their time. And once again, more magnesium was used on the bike's front and rear brake hubs, and the brakes also were still good enough to slow this big thumper whenever you needed to make a turn. Now the motor was a single cylinder 4-stroke that had a bore of 88mm and a stroke of 82mm. Now the engine also had a 4-speed gearbox, which was more than adequate for this big single cylinder bike with that huge torque that they produced, and dancing up and down the gearbox was certainly not required as you would do on maybe a buzzy 2-stroke, and often just closing the throttle was all that was required when you wanted to make a turn, and that was without using the brakes. Now once again, as I mentioned previously, this Japanese Mikuni carburetor is not correct for this bike for 1973, and I think it would have been an Amol concentric carburetor that would have been fitted to this bike at the Clues factory originally, although Rob had just fitted this particular carburetor to the bike to get it started, as he's known to do from time to time. Now fitting these footrests to the engine casings was another of Alan Clues's very innovative ideas, and many people at the time thought that this was such a crazy idea, and they thought that this would cause the casings to either crack or break. But in reality, there's never been a single case of this kind of failure, although often it was the actual metal footrest that would fail and not the actual casing mounting. But these alloy casings were cast by a local foundry to CCM's very own specifications, and then all the machining would be carried out at CCM's headquarters at Shifnal Street in Bolton. But these absolutely superb Mike Etoff frames were just works of art in their own right, and they were made from light gauge steel tubing and then bronze and argon welded before being chrome plated, which I assume was to make them more appealing to potential buyers. Now, as you know, these CCMs carried their engine oil lubrication inside the frame, and the 5 pints capacity was filled through this little filler cap that you can see just ahead of the fuel cap, and the oil was then pumped around the engine and then back into the frame. Now these lovely CCM slim fuel tanks were of course a trademark for many of the early CCM models, and they held about 1.5 gallons of fuel, which was usually enough to satisfy that big, thirsty BSA derived motor, and even the longest of race motors. And of course, painted black in this fantastic gloss colour, it certainly looked the part. Now again, all the controls on this bike are once more correct for the time period, with the proper levers, cables, and of course these CCM lever covers. And these parts are not very easy to come by these days, but there are parts available if you search hard enough to find them. And of course there still are reproduction parts available if you need them. Now these handlebars, as far as I'm aware, maybe not be the originals from 1973, but they are again period correct and certainly the same as would have been fitted by CCM at the time. But other parts, like these alloy handlebar clamps, are certainly the real deal, and of course the proper fixings for this 1973 machine. But these are certainly authentic and of very good quality. Now, if you remember earlier, we mentioned Andy Ainsworth, who was the first ever CCM works rider back in 1973, and Andy Ainsworth rode a very similar bike to this for the Alan Clues factory. Now, Rob told me that Alan Ainsworth came across this bike at a local motorcycle show some years back, and although Andy was made aware that this was not a fully original bike from that period, he did say to the bike's owner, Rob Hughes, that this is as close to his old works bike that he's ever seen, and he signed the rear mudguard of the bike to authenticate his statement. But these early 1973 first production CCM bikes were the first of many very successful models that CCM would go on to produce in the coming years. But of course, the first models are always the most interesting due to the fact that these were the early designs of what was still to come for the once great British manufacturer. And although our example here is maybe not a fully original bike, it's more than likely as near as you'll ever get or see to the first works CCM. And of course this bike also has that added significance in that it's signed by CCM's first ever watch rider, Andy Ainsworth. Now, we still have many more CCM classics to feature from the Rob Hughes collection, and he not only has these superb British-made Clues bikes, he also has some other very rare bikes as well, and you can see them all here on my YouTube channel by simply subscribing to Classic Dirt Bike TV. And this particular bit of British CCM history is another fine example of the kind of machines that Alan Clues put together in the very early years of CCM. And of course, Alan went on to produce some of Britain's greatest four-stroke motocross models. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that very brief look at Rob Hughes' 1973 CCM, and coming up in my next video we'll be taking a look at this lovely hybrid CZ machine belonging to Archie Baird. So once again, thanks for watching Classic Dirt Bike TV.